Hello everyone and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell and this is Dev Dive, a show where I get a chance to talk to interesting game developers about their games, and today I am joined by Mr. John Szymanski, the developer of Secret Agent Wizard Boy and the International Crime Syndicate, which is a very long title for a game that I'm have a great time talking to John about today. John, I'm very happy to have you to talk about this strange and kooky and weird game, and also just sort of dig into you and your history with game development and stuff, because I also played a number of your games to sort of prepare for this interview. But thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I note that you use the word interesting rather than regarded or excellent.
Yes.
I am an interesting developer.
I've used that in my intro for everyone, so I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment or... Well, I do mean it as a compliment. Of course I mean it as a compliment. I like interesting stuff. Do you not like interesting stuff?
Interesting is a lot better than uninteresting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. Though sometimes I find uninteresting things very interesting. But your games, I do think, are actually interesting, and I think they are actually good. I've enjoyed all of your games, all four of them that I have played, which is close to all of your games, and I'm curious to for you to share your sort of story with the audience. What's your history with game development? Like, how long have you been working on games, and then maybe just a brief sort of synopsis of the different projects you've worked on?
Yeah, a little bit of a complicated question. I started working on games more as like a child working on board games.
Okay.
So my dad has owned laundromats for a long time. We'd end up with large cardboard boxes, either from soap deliveries or machinery coming in. And one of the things that I would do as a kid is I'd take a flat piece of one of these boxes and I'd draw out a board game on it and, play a silly little board game with myself. They were never good, of course, but I love doing it. At some point, that interest kind of transitioned specifically into video games. I do enjoy board games still, but I mean, it's mostly been about the video games for most of my life. And we had limited screen time growing up, so what I would do is I'd do my video games in my screen time, 30 minutes, and then I would make myself a paper computer that I could pretend to be playing video games on. And then I would think about video games when I wasn't able to do either of those two things.
That's the secret. As soon as you know that you like video games, you can think about them whenever you want. No one can stop you. My mom didn't know that, and I did it all the time.
Yeah, no. Have you ever heard that research where it's like people thinking about making basketball shots tend to do almost as well as people actually practicing making basketball shots? Yeah. There's a lot that you can do to kind of practice or research things just by imaginating, as it were.
Yeah, and it seems like you were able to sort of train your own brain in your fascination with video games just by being passionate about them, even with the limited access you had to them.
Yeah, unconsciously, obviously. I was a kid, but there's probably something to say about that. That maybe that hyper-focused tendency is something that runs in my family, myself included. Anyway, that's kind of where things started. I actually started doing game development more when I was 14 with GameMaker. I downloaded it, just kind of toying around, realized that I had enough idea of how, you drag your blocks in, you say y velocity equals 9, just barely enough I could kind of figure it out to make myself a little platformer or some humorous game of some sort. And that kind of ended up being the point where the bug really hit. And I started doing that as most of the free time that I had, instead of playing games, that transitioned more into making them for many years. And then I ended up going to college for computer science to get some more official knowledge in coding. Ended up getting into the games industry proper via that knowledge, working with New Blood on Maximum Action. But the story of when games released, what games released, how they released, that kind of intersects with all of that at different points. But that's the overview.
Yeah, sure. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about you as a designer and looking at the games that you have been sort of the head creative on is that none of your games are similar in any way, shape, or form.
No,
the games that I've played are Rubber Ducky and the Rainbow Gun, Kyle is Famous, Exiled, and of course, Secret Agent Wizard Boy and the International Crime Syndicate. And they're all different genres, they are different lengths, they are different art styles. And so just again, to sort of dig into your design philosophy and what makes you so passionate about games, do you make a conscious effort to try something new every time you're looking at designing a new game?
Conscious? Maybe not. Although to say it's not conscious would probably be unfair in a way. Yeah, no, you're right. Stuff that I make just doesn't follow a form, really at all. And I'm not going to say that I try to do that purposely. It's quite honestly, it's a horrible business move, right? Anytime I gain any sort of player base in one category, there is a very high degree of likelihood that there is going to be very little crossover into the next product I make. So I'll tell you straight up, this is not for like some way of keeping people interested to make more money. This is very much just what I want to be doing. You know, these are the products that I find interesting. And it just so happens that what I find interesting and what I want to be doing doesn't really relate to each other all the time. Yeah. If nobody's run across the lineage of stuff that I've done, started with a 2D shooter, went on to doing a text-based adventure, highly narrative-based text-based adventure, as it needs to be, right? A fixed camera puzzle game. I did a first-person survival horror game with puppet mascot horror sort of stuff. And then the most recent game that I'm doing is kind of like a sandbox goat simmy meets Hitman wizard game. It's pretty vast, but there are some ideas that interlink that are maybe a little bit more under the surface. And I've been realizing as I've developed as a person, as a developer, that maybe that's the core identity of what I do. Yeah. You might notice exploration is a huge part in almost all of the games that I've made.
Okay, yeah.
And that isn't necessarily purposeful, but it just follows from what I think would make an interesting game to play, is that exploration and being rewarded for being curious are things that I seem to find interesting enough that I want to impart into my own project. Yeah, and that comes about in different ways. Puzzles are explorative by nature, you know. So you've got this puzzle game. You've got to experiment. You've got to be curious. Survival horror games are very explorative by nature. You've got to work through the environment. You've got to think about your resources. This sandbox game, extremely explorative. And then you take a look, and this really comes into perspective when you look at Kyle is Famous. I did a text-based adventure. And what is the general form of it? It is a text-based adventure with exploration aspects put onto it.
Absolutely.
And that is what the design of Kyle is Famous is. So, like, yeah, okay, they are very different, but there is still kind of like some underlying currents of what I seem to like to do as a developer. Which again, not conscious. This is just kind of what comes out as I'm thinking about things, you know?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm also curious as to how that intersects with you and your taste in video games. We were able to talk a little bit before, very passionate about games history, games collecting, especially. As you can see behind me, I'm also into that. And I think that's something that maybe you and I, on a taste level, might align on, is exploration. For me is the number one thing that I look for in my games. I'm not particularly interested in challenge. I like narrative quite a bit, but it's really being able to make my own choices and discover things that really draws me to any game. I'm not as much into, you know, an arcade or high score based game because there's not really exploration in those games. And so for you and the games that you gravitate towards or play, are there some games that you love the exploration in specifically that you might have taken inspiration from for any of the games that you've designed, or ones that you just like really recommend strongly or connect to strongly for their exploratory aspects?
That's a weird question. I don't know how to think about this. I have a really broad taste in games, and that's not just like trying to be like, oh yeah, I like all of them because I'm so cool. It really, what I choose to play, it's very hard to kind of pinpoint individual genres. You might think, I know a lot of people know me from My Friendly Neighborhood. You might think that I am a big horror guy. I do like horror games. I especially like survival horror games, particularly. That's one piece of many. If you look at my top 10 games list, you know, look at it. If I were to describe it to you, let me say, some stuff on there might be really surprising. Kirby's Epic Yarn is one.
I love that game. Yeah.
Phenomenal.
Hey, that game has great exploration. You can find all the little patches, you find little secret exits. That's great.
But other stuff that would be on there, Shining Force on the Genesis is one of my favorite favorite games, has been since I was a child. I love Resident Evil, The Umbrella Chronicles. Weirdly enough, that's probably in my top 3 or 4 Resident Evil games. But it's kind of weird. You know, we talk about exploration, and here we have a rail shooter on games that I find to be like most interesting and influential of anything that I've played. It's a rail shooter. It's like almost what you'd expect to be the exact opposite of those tastes that I just said. So I've thought about this. I've tried to pin it down. And I don't really think I have an underlying theme in what games seem to strike me, other than ones that are curious or interesting. Do the tastes relate to the product? I don't think I have a solid answer, and maybe won't have a solid answer for a very long time about that.
No, and that is totally fine, because while you have made a number of games, your major releases, I would say Kyle is Famous is like your first like full game, because you said Rub Ducky was started as like a smaller project. Only started in 2019, and so Kyle is Famous, My Friendly Neighborhood, Exiled, Secret Agent Wizard Boy, and then of course working on Maximum Action and helping your brother David on the Pony Factory. These games have all happened in the last 6 years. And so you're just really getting started on your game design career. And so I find it really fascinating, someone who's able to and interested in exploring a variety of different genres and concepts. And so focusing in on Secret Agent Wizard Boy, which I guess I think I'll just call Wizard Boy, so I don't have to say
That's totally fine.
More than 2 words.
I am so upset you're not using the full title.
I'll get over it. But for that game in particular, do you remember what the first idea that you had that ended up turning into this game was, and sort of when that idea happened in terms of timescale?
Yeah, so whenever I'm looking at doing a project for a long period of time, so we're not talking about like a few months, we're talking about a year, 2 or 3. Remember, that's a significant chunk of life. And this is going to be the thing that I am engaging hours of time in. And not only that, I'm asking other people to engage hours of time per day to be working on these projects. When we're approaching a project like that, it's not just all about a single idea. It's also about logistical factors. It's also about making sure that this will be a interesting project over a long term to be engaging with. It's something that I need to make sure that I feel could be marketable, because if it is not marketable, not just I will be out of a job, but other people will also be out of a job as well. So, okay. So we're talking about such a game here. This is a game that we've already spent a year on. It's in early access now, so we're probably going to spend at least another year on it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Just speaking logistically, that is likely the case. Yeah, so there's obviously going to need to be some cross-section between what do I think I'm going to remain interested in working on, what do I think I can really reasonably ask other people to remain interested in over a long period of time, and then what do I think is going to be marketable as well. So thinking about these things, something that I find particularly interesting is this idea of like humorous failure. I find it very funny when a game is almost actively working against you, but isn't punishing you. So there's a fine balance there. So Dark Souls works against you and punishes you. So that's not necessarily funny. Can be funny, but that's not quite the humor that I'm looking for. I'm looking for it's working against you, but it's not necessarily punishing you at the same time. So that's a concept. Then the exploration, the curiosity. Okay, there's a concept. Also, when we were growing up, there was sets of wizard games, unnamed wizard games, that we had this idea of like, wouldn't it be so cool if instead of being locked to these individual places that we can cast these individual spells, if it was a lot more freeform and goofy and would allow us to be more creative, these sort of buzzwords, creativity, humor. You start putting those together in a package in your mind, and you start thinking, okay, I've got these ideas of what I would like to create. How do they realistically come together into a product that would be designable and interesting? Because even a good concept is going to be a terrible product if you don't think about why it would be a good product. So we went along with that. We talked about what would be interesting in terms of being a little wizard that has a bunch of different spells that you can do. You know, is it that you're in a freeform environment? Is it that you're in linear environments? How much combat is there? Are you combating people all the time? Is this a combat simulator, or is this something else? As I was thinking about these things, the thing that I felt really sure would tie them together correctly was in-sim design.
Okay, sure.
So in-sims are slower paced. They're a little bit more explorational by default, if that kind of makes sense. But then the thing that's really interesting is you have all these systems that come together that interact with each other. That's the basis of in-sim design, is systems that interact with each other. And that flows very naturally into this idea of having spells that kind of affect things differently in different silly ways. And I also kind of saw a hole in the market of an in-sim that really let you be egregious with things, that would let you very willingly break things, that would react very appropriately if you've done something truly ridiculous, like made your explosive barrel extremely large, and then you set it off and the explosion would just be way larger than is appropriate. You know, I couldn't really think of an in-sim that allowed you to express yourself like that. There's the humor, okay? And we've got the exploration, and we've got this idea of being like a little wizard in a little area. Okay, so sandboxy, it starts to tie together once you think about all of those desires, what design would really fit all of them. And so that was essentially the basis, you know. And when you're thinking about how to design the product, you've got the things you want, you've got the things that you kind of need to do to make the things that you want work together, and then it's just a matter of, well, can we do it?
And you did. The game is out, and as you said, in early access. I've played it, and I think what you've keyed me into is that this game, I think, kind of draws in two separate influences, which is the immersive sim design of being able to approach things from different angles, do things sort of maybe out of order if you would like to. That definitely appeals to me, as some of my favorite games are things like BioShock or Prey or Dishonored, and these games that I love just like getting in every nook and cranny of. And then also something that is definitely something the current market has a lot of appeal to, which is games that have fun physics and lead to funny moments of interactivity. Games like Goat Simulator, as you mentioned, or Happy Wheels, like these things that are very much about physics and comedy. To this point, never the twain shall meet. But now the twain have met. In Secret Agent Wizard Boy. And I think that's an interesting combo. So for you, when going into designing this game and thinking about the different elements that you would then put together to make a unique project, were there any specific games that you were pulling from on a design level or a tonal level that you then were able to put together?
Oh, sure. I mean, absolutely. I would argue that half of the job of like the designer director really should be figuring out which sources to be drawing influence from, you know, because at the end of the day, what you produce is a combination of what you've
absolutely
took. Some notable ones, I did do some playing of Deus Ex. It's not really the same sort of in-sim design, but you still want to go to the classics, right? That was an inspiration source. There might be some obvious aesthetic inspiration sources to certain Wizard games of our past that you might be able to draw some reference to. Maybe less overall influence than is like obvious. Like aesthetic influences, sure, you know, like that's clear, but there's a lot of differences in like the microcosms of what are going on there, you know. I feel like I am constantly taking design influence from things like Resident Evil Remake. The design of that game is very clear and clean and just very good in general. It was a huge design influence for My Friendly Neighborhood. But that idea of like there being an environment, how does that environment interact with you exploring it? That game's a phenomenal reference for that idea. As an example, just as an aside, this is something that Evan and I have talked about. When you think about exploring an environment, you've got this static environment and you're going through it at your own pace, and you kind of view that maybe as like you exploring the static thing. I don't think that's true. I think that Resident Evil 1, particularly the remake, really shows that the environment is talking back to you. If you go somewhere and you've explored something, the environment needs to give you something back in return. And so a lot of the times in Resident Evil 1, this is a pickup of some sort, right? But it's deeper than that. You've also learned something about your environment. And so then when you die, when you have to do it again, what else have you gained? You've gained knowledge about what your environment is like. This is a really interesting concept, and it engages something really deep in our brain about how we as humans function that says, okay, I gained knowledge. I didn't just gain the item, I gained information. And that's like a really core sort of emotional reaction to say, I did something and now I'm smarter because of it, you know? So like when it comes to trying to figure out, okay, what makes an environment interesting to explore, this is an emotion I want people to have, you know? So in that way, Resident Evil is a reference, as it always is for me in very many ways. Hitman, I have not actually played Hitman directly in relation to working on this game, but it is absolutely a reference in many ways, because the idea of like, hey, we're a third-person game, we're set in a sandbox environment, we have in-sim elements, there's a lot of similarities there, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Goat Simulator is a reference as well. I don't want to overstate that, because I think you could kind of see gameplay of Wizard Boy and think, okay, it's just a ragdoll sim. Yeah, I mean, it's goofy in that way, but the goofiness is kind of as far as the relationship goes to Goat Simulator. Sure, I love that sort of humor, but there is, mechanically, it is vastly different. The idea is almost kind of like Goat Sim with a game loop, you know?
Sure, yeah.
I guess I could go on, but there's a lot of different little tiny bits that I like to pull from different little tiny things, you know?
Yeah. Of course. And what I think is interesting about me going into Wizard Boy and not knowing almost anything about it structurally, especially, is that at least as of now with the game just been out for a couple days and in early access, the game doesn't have an obvious structure. And I find that very fascinating. There is no tutorial. There is no, this is how things work. This is where you need to go. The game plops you into its world. There's a narrative thrust that is why your character has a goal, but on a structured level within the game's design, you are given free reign to discover spells at your own pace, discover areas at your own pace, and collect the different gems that you need to open this door at your own pace. And so for you, I'm curious in terms of exploration and also like game design in terms of teaching players how a game works. What was the sort of conversations you had either with yourself or like the people that you were working with on what kind of tutorials this game should or should not have? Because I was very confused at first. I'm like, did I miss something? Like, did I skip the tutorial? What's going on here? And then you just have to discover things at your own pace, which of course is very gratifying, but there isn't really a design push. You're just kind of plopped in. And so I'm curious what your philosophy is on that.
Yeah. So a couple things to season the conversation with. You are a spy. What do spies do? They investigate. They find things out. They are the ones going in to get the information to utilize it for their own purposes, right? So if you're going to make a game where you're playing as a spy, giving somebody all the information to be able to conquer the game, essentially, totally counter to the idea of being a spy in the first place. So that's a factor at play here. But then you've got another factor, which is frustration. So if you give the player literally nothing, you try in no way to give them any information about what they need to do, oh man, that's incredibly frustrating. And you can, to a degree, by the way, we did not hit this perfectly right out the gate. People did express frustration over this, and we had to tweak things with some updates. I think we're at a point where I think we've eliminated the worst of it. There's two conflicting things, you know. We've got this need to investigate, to let the player investigate. It works with the idea of exploration, curiosity, and being a spy, you know? Yeah. But then we also need to eliminate frustration so that the game remains engaging. Mm-hmm. So where's the balance? Not a simple question. So there's a few things that we've done that are kind of silently helping. So for instance, you start in front of a spell book. It's the first thing that you see. And when you walk over to that spell book, you're immediately greeted with a pop-up that tells you, hey, here's how you cast the spell. So we haven't told the player directly that you are going to be casting spells and how to cast a spell. We've let them walk over to a spell book, get a pop-up, and realize in their own head, oh, right, I can use this to do stuff in the environment. Okay, so a similar thing, but presented differently, works with the design of the game versus just being a straight tutorial. Okay,
Sure.
so there's one. When it comes to like, hey, what is the overall goal of the game? So this is something we actually experimented with in the demo. So
Okay.
we started with giving players functionally only one tying point to what they should do, which is at the end of the intro cutscene, we had the camera zoom in on the little shape door and said, oh yeah, the mysteries of the castle at the same time. And so the idea is to subconsciously lodge in the player's brain, okay, there's something mysterious about that door. I need to go figure out what the mystery is. And then the door shapes, you'll notice, have little purple particle effects that come out of them. And that's the same in the door sockets. Okay?
Yeah.
So then you can make this mental link of saying, okay, there's a similar visual element. Therefore, that should be the solution to the mystery of the door. I want to engage with that. And then once you do, you've completed the demo. You've solved the mystery. Okay. So in the demo, that worked all right. The main complaint in the demo was I'm not 100% sure what I should do. So it didn't work fully for everybody. Yeah. And then when coming into early access, we have a way bigger play space. Okay, so that's another problem because we're not as confined. And so those sort of like leading lines might not be as obvious. Okay, so what we've done, we've added a little readout that comes at the beginning of each week that just says, investigate the mystery door. It's way more blatant, but it's you know, that's your mission briefing. Okay,
Yeah,
so it's not
that can be a spy thing easily.
Yeah, right. It's still a spy thing. Okay, it's your mission briefing. We're not giving you too much information, but it's a lot more blatant. Okay, so but that reinforces every single week. Instead of just being something that pops up the first time and you forget about it, it reinforces every week. So what I kind of see happening watching gameplay is people will totally ignore it, which is reasonable. It's reasonable to ignore that, die a whole bunch, the week resets, and then it comes back again, and immediately they're like, oh, yeah, okay, we need to be investigating the door. And that's reinforced in their head. Okay, there is a goal to be had. It's up to me to figure out what that goal is. Because just the statement, investigate the dungeon mystery door, doesn't mean too much. But once it's lodged in your head and then you go down and you see a door with a bunch of particle effects around it, you get the point. You know, players are very smart. They latch onto things. Once you give them the tools to do that, all you need to do is make sure that you're giving them the right tools. So there's a bunch of minutia about how the castle is laid out, where we've placed objects, etc., that function into these general ideas about how to do the design. It's making sure that we're keeping things explorative, making sure that we're rewarding players for being curious, and giving them these subconscious leading lines that are pushing them back towards the overall goal of what they should be doing without explicitly telling them to. It seems to work pretty well. I mean, I can't really name a single person that I've seen either play or in the reviews or like anybody that's given me feedback that has said that they don't know how to accomplish the mission in the game. Maybe some of them haven't or got frustrated and we had to tweak things. Sure, fine. But I think that everybody understood what the goal was. And that, in my mind, means that all those little leading lines probably came together to work, you know?
Yeah. And one of the things about this game that I'm sure was very difficult to polish up and to make sure it was succeeding in that design of leading players around and sort of teaching you as you go is the level design layout. The castle and that you're exploring is very labyrinthine. There are little vents that you can crawl through. There are secret doors. There are buttons you can press that open up different passageways. And I'm curious for you what that process was like of designing a very intricately complex level layout, because most of the games that you have designed previously are, I mean, almost don't even really have level design. I mean, Kyle is famous is there's not spaces. Excel doesn't really
level
have
design. Is it? I don't know. Yeah, no, I get what you mean. Yeah,
but that being something that's at least relatively new for you, how difficult was that to sort of tweak layouts and add pathways until it felt right
Sure.
for players to explore.
Now, I will add one thing to that. My Friendly Neighborhood does
Yes.
have kind of a bit of a similar thing.
Definitely.
So there is a little bit of practice to come into play there, coming from that game. But nonetheless, the big difference there is that's a survival horror game with confined rooms that interlink with each other. This is a sandbox game with a castle that is in a singular space, and the rooms are really not confined. There's hallways all over the place. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, this is something that is just strictly extremely difficult to do. I view it almost as miraculous that things came together as well as they did. I cannot tell you how many drafts of the castle we went through just to get something that was passable. I don't by any means think that the castle as is like a perfect representation of sandbox environment development. By no means, but at least it works. You know?
Sure.
And just getting to that, oh man, that's really tough to do. It really is, you know?
So what were some of the mistakes you made in the early drafts of the castle that you then like, we have to polish this up or it's not going to work?
Yeah, so many. Rooms being too large, rooms not having enough interesting things to keep that feedback loop of I'm being curious and I get a reward for it. Things not interconnecting enough, things interconnecting too much. Like minutia in like just environment design. Oh, it doesn't look interesting. I don't feel like I'm in a castle. This is not a place I want to explore. It's just a constant cavalcade of these issues. And even down to like the last week or two before we released early access, we were still making large changes in the castle design because it's like, yeah, that still is not working. That still feels way too disconnected from the rest of the castle. So I go up in there and I spend way too much time and then I don't come back this way. And it's frustrating me because I'm not getting to those other places that have those other important things that I need to do. It's constantly difficult. But at the end of the day, really the design philosophy that we ended up landing on that seems to work pretty well. Maybe other people know this already, and I'm just now figuring it out. Going back to like old FPS designs like Doom, Quake, you know, things like that, they always designed in loops. Or should I say they didn't always design in loops, but the levels that people like are the ones that were designed with interconnecting loops. Okay, that's a place to start. So we're thinking about miniature interconnecting loops, and we just and the idea is trying to figure out how those loops interconnect with each other. And once you put that design into practice, suddenly everybody has a chance to get to every other place in the castle, because at some point they are going to interconnect back onto a different loop, and they will get there in the end. And once we did that, things started to work. It was really only at that point, and we only figured this out a few weeks before we were supposed to launch into early access.
Okay.
But yeah, no, seriously, like when I say this was a very difficult thing for us to do, I really mean it. Evan is the guy who like really super spearheaded actually bringing the environment together in terms of like making all the modeling and figuring out when things were not working and stuff. And I mean, he just went through so many revisions, just so many revisions. Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about sort of the level design and structure of the game, but another big element of the game are the spells and the ways that they interact with the environment. I think that is probably the core gameplay loop that draws in the most players. Like, what can I do with a fire spell, a pushing spell, a thing that makes things bigger, a duplication spell, all these things that we sort of have the archetypes in our head for, but we want to know how they interact with this environment. And so with spells, what were sort of the first ones that you came up with? And then as you were sort of iterating with spells, were there ones you had to cut because they weren't working? Were there ones that you are maybe thinking like, okay, I want to kind of make sure we include this, make sure it works? What was the coming up with spells process like for this game?
Okay, so first of all, yeah, there's a ton that we cut. So we always knew that you needed a base spell that just kind of blatantly interacted with things. So this would be the first one you get. You cast it on anything in the game, it is going to give you some sort of a reaction. Because that's just a basic feedback loop. You do a thing, it gives you something back. We knew that needed to be the first thing. This is a very complicated spell because it needs to work for baseline interactions, make sure that they're not too egregious, because you want that ramp up of like, hey, I've done something egregious. The game is giving me back something egregious. So it can't be too egregious by default. It needs to work for combat as well. That's kind of difficult, and it needs to have the ability to scale itself so that you can make it egregious. So this first spell is Prodify, for anybody who's played the game. Yeah, Prodify. Yeah. And on the surface, it seems like really, really basic, but it took a really long time to get it to a place where it's like, this seems to be affecting things enough that it is satisfying, but not affecting them too much that we do not have any design space for anything else in the game. So you'll notice you have to charge it before it really does anything, let's say, combatively important. Okay, that was something that took us like 4 or 5 months to figure out. Okay, when you're the designer, the first thing you're like is press the button, cast the spell. That makes sense. And like, it just wasn't working, and the combat didn't feel good. And then I'd switch it around, and then it's like, now it's too bad, and I can't kill anybody or ragdoll them. I mean, nobody's dying. Obviously, they get back up next week. But like, all this fine tuning, and eventually Evan was like, well, have you just tried making it charge? And I was like, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound fun. I hate the idea of like, you don't get an action when you click the button. But then we tried it, and instantly it's like, oh, something actually is working here. And then we were like, well, maybe we need to have people fall down when they get hit by the charged version. Because then maybe you can like push them off of places, because that was a whole discussion. How much should this push people? Because we want you to be able to push people off of things. But like, if you can just cast a spell and do that, it's too easy. You didn't put any work in to do it. And so like, a lot of fine tuning later, we kind of figured out that, you want to be able to charge it for it to do the important thing, so that there's some action that you have to go through to make it happen. That also means it's a lot harder to do because other people are casting spells that can collide with it. So you have to be a lot more intentional about when you're actually casting the spell. And then it's going to have a bigger effect than we initially planned when you actually do hit with that spell. So it's a little bit more satisfying when you actually do it. So then all of that combined finally made one spell that worked. Okay.
There we go. We got the basic spell done.
We got one
Congratulations,
out of
team.
that. And so, and this is just the case with like all of them. Man, I'll say, if you take a look at the set of spells and like, anybody that's listening, without knowing what the spells are, go ahead and make a list of what spells you think would be fun in a sandbox wizard game. And then I'll tell you, the list is going to be super different. It's not going to be at all the same, because when it comes down to it, the ability to just like do something and that thing always happens the same way is not very fun for a sandbox. I mean, it sounds really fun, but then in practice, it's not. Like Duckify, making it so that you can turn everybody into a duck. That sounds hilarious. I want to do that. But once you do it twice, you're done.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Because there's very little to explore with that.
There's very little to explore.
Earlier. Yeah.
It's not creative, right? Yeah, you're not rewarding people for wanting to interact with it. And so choosing what spells are going to be part of the game and how they interact with things is this very, very reductive process where you've got to come up with a lot of ideas and then cut down to just a couple, the ones that actually have the most amount. And then let me just throw this other wrench into the system. These need to also work for puzzle solving. And that's a whole nother thing. Like, what spells are we putting in the game that is going to make puzzle solving impossible? What are we going to be able to do with puzzles that couldn't just be completely blasted through by this spell? The puzzles are pretty simple, but nonetheless, if you have spells that just make it possible to get through all of them, they're even more simple. Eventually we settled, or I guess maybe I settled. I was kind of the person who was championing fewer spells that have more creative potential, but we settled on, you've got a push spell. You've got a spell that can precisely move objects into place, but not all. Small ones will go into your hand, and large ones won't be affected at all. Okay. We've got spells that will make things bigger and smaller, because that's really fun,
Of course.
And then you kind of have this weird dynamic where, like, as things get bigger and smaller, their properties change as well. So that's really fun and interesting and creative. You can experiment with that a lot. We've got a spell that can duplicate things, which is horribly overpowered. We've designed around it. We know that it is overpowered, but we've designed everything in the game around it, and we want it because it's really fun, right? One spell that's not quite there that we're working on is the possession spell, so you can possess any other NPC. Right now, it's a little bit too boring. It's a little bit too static, but we were aware of that, and there are things that we are going to be changing with it that's going to make it a lot more interesting in the future. But it's in there right now because we kind of wanted to give a little reward for completing the game, so you get this kind of fun little spell to make you jump back in and try it a couple times. It does something goofy, great, you're done. But I think that one's going to turn into maybe one of the more interesting ones, because we're kind of thinking about like, well, what happens if you cast possession on not an NPC, like a prop?
Oh gosh. That introduces a lot of questions, but also, especially on the design side, a lot of problems.
Right? And both, right? But what if you can depossess things? So that suddenly is a way to like position NPCs around. Interesting. These are all like some potentials for this spell that we're still kind of working through on our end. And then there's the fire spell, just general fire spell. And then there's the general damage spell that you don't even have access to. That is just for NPCs. Pretty short list. The list is extremely curated. We cut down from a ton of other stuff down to that. Those are the ones that I felt were most creative and most interesting.
Yeah, and that is a perfect example of the iteration of the design process and the elimination of the design process. Just because something sounds like it'd be fun, you have to actually make it work, and you have to make it work in the context of all the other systems you're designing. And I also am curious about the scope of this game and your intentions in terms of early access, knowing that you were going to release it in early access before you felt you were complete with it, and the 1.0 is out. How did you decide this is sort of the scope that the early access version is going to be? And then you don't have to reveal all the secrets, but do you have sort of an idea of how long you would like to work on the game, or like maybe how much you feel like it is complete now versus what the final project will actually be?
Yeah. So the scope is as much a function of logistics as it is of if we had the ability to make the full game in a year, we would have done that. Just frankly, launching an early access is always about logistics. For us, it was more about like, what do we feasibly think we can accomplish within a year? And that's what we shot for, which was to make a solid base of a sandbox area that has a lot of cool, interesting things to find and a bunch of interactions between the systems. Okay, I think we got there. It seems like everybody that's playing the game agrees that we got there. Great. So now the question is, what do we add to the game that is going to keep that alive, but is also going to like bring it into a completed product? We've got some pretty solid ideas of what that will be. In fact, maybe some ideas that people are not even expecting, but I think once they're there, people are going to be like, oh, yeah, that actually really functions in with the design a lot. So we'll leave that for a later date, explaining what exactly those are. But definitely expanding the sandbox nature of the game, 100% a priority. Giving more validation to the sandbox environment. I know that's like a super weird term to use, but like saying when you have been exploiting this sandbox environment, that is going to be good for you in a different way in terms of gameplay. That's really important to us as well, because that's giving that feedback. You were curious. Here's your reward for being curious. You now are going to be better in this other sense, in a different form of this gameplay. So that's something that we're working on. One thing we just know we want to do, it's probably not going to be the first update, the second, or the third update, but we really want to add like another full sandbox area, probably an outside to the castle. That would be really fun. That's been something we've wanted to do, and probably would have done if we had had more time, for first early access release. Adding a front cap and an end cap, bookending the experience. How do we get narratively the player into this place, and what is the satisfying conclusion to it?
Sure.
That's really important. So we're thinking about that too.
Yeah, and that makes sense in terms of just padding, and I don't necessarily mean that in like the usual negative sense of game design, but filling out the sort of surroundings of this game. You've got the core, and then what's going to be that icing? What's going to be that nice plate for the cupcake to sit on? You got to work on the sort of supporting elements of it. So I think that's really fascinating, especially because obviously I've never made a game. I've never made one for early access, and so you think about the core and then really supporting it afterward. I think that's interesting. And I'm also curious for the collaboration process of you and the games that you have made. We've mentioned them a couple times throughout this video, but you have two brothers who are also game designers, Evan and David, and the three of you work in different combinations on different projects and stuff. And so I'm curious what the collaborative process is like. What did Evan and David do for Wizard Boy? I also saw that and mentioned that you were part of working on Pony Factory, David's game that just came out last year. And so how do you sort of balance all these different projects, and what roles do people fill in terms of all the collaboration?
Yeah, it's messy, right? In terms of like, there is no strict role definitions.
Yeah.
Generally, David does his own stuff. Every once in a while, I will come on to help in some, like, usually non-design way. Like for the Pony Factory, I helped with some back-end coding stuff. So like getting gamepad kind of shoved in there. So David kind of likes doing his own thing. On Wizard Boy, David is acting as producer and the music guy. That's another thing that David often will do for projects that I've worked on is help with music. Evan tends to be somebody who does narrative and environment, which are actually not quite as removed from each other as you might expect.
Yeah, sure. Environmental storytelling.
Environmental storytelling is a thing, and honestly, it comes up a lot more than you think, even like subconsciously. So that is where he kind of tends to gravitate towards. I tend to gravitate towards mechanical design or overarching design of a product. I also, for whatever reason, I've just kind of become the guy who does a lot of sound design. David also does sound design for his own stuff. I do sound design for my own things. I don't know why that happens. At this point, I would say I'm the person who has the most experience with voice acting, because I had to do quite a lot of work with that for Kyle is Famous and for My Friendly Neighborhood. So at this point, I'd say I'm probably the one who's kind of the go-to for that sort of thing. But in terms of who's working on what on any given project, usually I'm directing my projects, and I kind of ask Evan or David to be part of pieces of it, kind of knowing that their knowledge is just simply better than mine.
Yeah. Everyone's got their strong suits.
Everybody's got their strong suits. Everybody has those things that just at the core, they're just better at. Every person in the world has that. Evan and David have that. I've got that. Tucker has that. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a game of like really weaseling out, okay, what truly are you just better at? And let's try to make sure that you're in that role. Yeah, as it is, I am the main programmer on all of the projects I do. Honestly, there are people out there that are just simply better at it. I mean, and I would love to just be able to give that over to them and say, go and run in this playground that you are excellent in, that I am only mediocre in, you know? Yeah. And there's a few different places like that. I think Evan, if he was able to just focus on like, how does the narrative aspects of a game soak into every other piece of a game, I think he would be excellent at that exact thing. So that's something I would love to relieve his pressure on having to like construct an environment and make textures and models, and be able to like let him be just in that position and really dig into that position, you know. But these are all logistical factors. You gotta work with what you work with, you know. So
yeah, and especially on the indie scale, when you don't have, you know, a group of people filling every different role. You don't have people that are specifically hired to do each thing. There's some crossover, and people got to fill the roles that they have some skill in, even if it's not their greatest skill. And the last thing that I want to ask you before we close out here is games that you recommend to people. We've talked about a couple of games that you like, but are there any things that are like kind of hidden gems, or things that you have like a personal fascination for that you don't think many people have heard of, maybe that we could recommend here as we close out this interview?
Yeah. Okay. So for developers, Resident Evil 1 Remake, I say is a must. I still recommend...
Nice hidden gem there.
It's phenomenal. I mean, in terms of design, not necessarily enjoyment, but just in terms of design, it's functionally flawless. And I really mean that. And I don't say that for really any other game, including Resident Evil 4, which is just straight up probably more fun to play for most people. Resident Evil 1's design is immaculate. And so if you're a developer, I would highly recommend playing through it. One that might not come to mind for a lot of people that I just want to shout out because I think it is really underlooked is Hypnospace Outlaw. I think.
Oh, I just did an interview
with Jay
a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
We put that up a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that game's incredible. It is extremely unique, extremely well conceived, and has like a really good emotional impact. I think that game deserves a lot more attention. Not that it hasn't gotten good attention. I think it deserves more attention. Yeah, I'm sure I could go on for a while, but those are a few.
But John, thank you very much for joining me, exploring the design process, your history with games, and of course, talking a little bit about Secret Agent Wizard Boy and the International Crime Syndicate. There you go. Wanted to close it out with a full name of the game just to make sure everyone is happy.
Yeah.
If you're interested in everything that John said here, and interested by the gameplay that you've been seeing of Secret Agent Wizard Boy and the International Crime Syndicate, feel free to go buy it on Steam in the early access and see the game evolve over the course of however long you decide to work on the game, and check out some of his other projects as well. By the time this is uploaded, I'm not sure if the Steam sale will still be going, but his games are, I think, very much worth the price. I've enjoyed all the ones that I've played. And John, thank you very much for joining me and sort of talking all sorts of stuff about games.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It is legitimately an honor when somebody says, I would like to sit down and ask you about things. That means a lot. So I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time.